Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And we want to start just by expressing we're thinking of all of those in the path of Hurricane Ian and hope that you and your families and communities are safe and remain safe until all of the dangers subside. Welcome to our audience and to a special welcome to tonight's guests, Larry Diamond and Ruth Ben-Ghiat. With the current events domestically and this week's election of a far-right leader in Italy, this topic is very timely. Strongmen from Mussolini to the present. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks as always to our leadership team, which in addition to me includes David Lehrer, former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazin, and Caroline Kelly. Next week, in observance of Yom Kippur, we will not be hosting a program, but the following week on October 12th, Dahlia Lithwick, senior legal correspondent at Slate, and Rick Hassan of UCLA Law, one of the country's foremost election law experts, will discuss women, law, and the battle to save America, a conversation based upon Dahlia Lithwick's just released book called Lady Justice. Remember, we do have closed captioning. I'm going to put it in the chat in a minute how to access it, but it's all on from our end. Sometimes you have to do something from your end to be able to activate that, and I'll put it in the chat as soon as I'm done speaking. Thanks again for all your donations of any size. They enable our series, so we're really appreciative. Just a short word about the upcoming fast day, Yom Kippur, known as the most serious and important of all Jewish holidays. On Yom Kippur, the idea is to seek forgiveness and atonement with the goal of trying to improve ourselves and our society. The prayers we decide on Yom Kippur, if we do, relate to social sins, the sins of lying, cheating in business, disrespecting other human beings, and so on. The 26-hour fast is not just intended to leave us empty and hungry. It's intended to motivate us to improve ourselves and through that, to improve our society. We hope that you share the optimism and faith of our America at a Crossroads leadership, that through our engagement, we collectively can bring about positive changes to our local communities and to our country, changes that will help us preserve our personal integrity, our personal freedom, and that will help us also preserve our democracy. For those who observe, we wish you a happy and healthy new year and a meaningful Yom Kippur, which leads us all to renewal and a re-energized state, both in body and spirit. Now, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, David Lehrer, for a few more announcements. David?
Thank you, Janice. I'd like to add my prayers to those of Janice for the residents of Florida, where we have a good number of viewers, friends, and family. The impact of Hurricane Ian looks chilling, even from 2,500 miles away. Our best wishes are with you all. This is our 125th consecutive weekly program dating back to the initial days of COVID over 2 years ago. We're proud of the lineup of world-class guests and moderators that we offer every Wednesday evening. We're grateful to you for your continued interest, support, and kind words. They make this effort all worthwhile. We are, again, a lucky bunch. When we arranged for tonight's guest, Professor Ben-Ghiat, we knew that the topic of authoritarian leaders would unfortunately still be current and salient, but we had no idea that her other area of expertise, Italian politics, would be hyper timely as well. With this week's election in Italy, the implications of that vote are top of mind. Following in the program that Janice just mentioned, we will host the following week the New York Times chief White House correspondent, Peter Baker, along with Susan Glasser, the New Yorker's White House maven, and they'll be discussing revelations from their just published bestseller, The Divider, Trump in the White House 2017 to 2021. As the New York Times said in its review, it's all here. There'll be a discussion with KCRW's Madeline Brand. The following week, we will host a much-needed examination of crime in America with two experts. Bill Bratton, former commissioner of the New York Police Department and former chief of the LA Police, together with Michael Moore, the present chief of the LAPD. They will join the Los Angeles Times' Pat Morrison to discuss crime in America, myth versus reality. That'll be on October 26th. Now to introduce and moderate tonight's dialogue, Professor Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution and Stanford University. He's the former director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's been an advisor to governments and international organizations for decades, helping them to develop and sustain democratic institutions. He's the perfect person to address the challenging topics of this evening with Professor Ghiat. Larry?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Janice. Thank you all for joining It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to engage Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, and one of the most important contemporary scholars of both Italian fascism and of fascism and authoritarianism more generally. Her first two books, Fascist Modernities and Italian Fascism's Empire Cinema, detail what happens to societies when authoritarian governments take hold, and they explore the appeal of strong men to both collaborators and followers. Her latest book, Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present, first published in 2020 and now out in paperback with a new epilogue, examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over a century. Her keen insights into how authoritarian leaders and parties mobilize, propagandize, and threaten democracy have made her a popular commentator on television and in publications such as The New Yorker and The Washington Post. She also publishes Lucid, a Substack newsletter about threats to democracy. You can find it at lucid.substack.com. Ruth, I might add, grew up in Pacific Palisades and graduated magna cum laude from UCLA before obtaining her PhD in comparative history from Brandeis University. So Ruth, welcome, and a special welcome back home to LA in a sense from our very substantial audience there, which hosts this remarkable series. I am sorry we're meeting under these historical circumstances, but as David and Janice said, your scholarly expertise has never been more sorely needed than at this moment. So Italy's far-right party, Brothers of Italy, has just led a right-wing coalition to victory in the Italian parliamentary elections just this past Sunday, and its leader, Giorgia Meloni, is now poised to become prime minister. In your article in The Atlantic a few days ago, you said Meloni would, quote, represent continuity with Italy's darkest episode, the interwar dictatorship of Benito Mussolini. An leading Italian historian agrees, describing her party as, quote, in line with the neo-fascist tradition. So I want to get to Meloni and the Brothers of Italy, but first I want you to explain conceptually, what is fascism? What makes a party or leader fascist or neo-fascist? And how is fascism distinct from other forms of authoritarianism?
Oh boy. Well, thank you very much, Larry, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Janice and David and for having me here. It's very special since I am from Los Angeles and actually got interested in fascism growing up in a place where so many exiles from Nazism had resettled. And I started thinking as a teenager about what that meant to have to leave your country in order to survive. And that set me on the path of studying fascism. So yes, my inbox right now is full of right-wing people telling me that I'm getting fascism all wrong. So there's a lot of misinformation about fascism right now. There are people, the American right and the global right are telling you that fascism is a left-wing movement. And they're doing that because they want to blame the violence of fascism on the left. And of course, Mussolini had been a socialist. And what fascism, one good way to start talking about it is Mussolini had been a journalist. He was very good with pithy slogans and turns of phrase. And he called fascism a revolution of reaction, which is a paradox. And fascism had this revolutionary element, but of course it was billed as a return to order. And the very first victims of fascism in the early 1920s was the left, and then expanded to gay people, of course Jews, people who were Slavic, all kinds of border minorities. So fascism, of course, is a hyper-nationalist movement, imperialist movement, the classic fascism. Uses rhetoric of victimhood, both the leader as a victim and the nation, which is victimized by an unfair international state system. And in the 1930s, that was the League of Nations, which in the German case, Hitler said had, kind of completely humiliated Germany. But Mussolini, Italy came out on the winning side of World War I, but he said that Italy's victory had been mutilated and robbed because they didn't get all the territories they wanted. So the victimhood is very, very important to fascism. And really, the paradox is important, the revolution of reaction, because both things are alive in fascism. This kind of total upheaval where lawlessness and violence become institutionalized, but equally important is alliances with conservatives. And the famous story, we all know that German conservatives invited Hitler in. Mussolini was invited in by the king. He made an alliance with the Catholic Church. So that tension between kind of revolution and reaction is alive in this day. And Giorgia Meloni in Italy goes around saying things like, if you want to rebel, you have to be a conservative. So that tension has remained today.
Well, we can imagine a lot of politicians going back to the early 1990s and Newt Gingrich saying something almost like that. You have to be a conservative to embrace a rebellion for fundamental change or whatever. But does all of that capture Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy? I mean, a revolution of reaction, hyper-nationalist, anti-minorities, grievances against outsiders, strong sense of victimhood. Does that describe the Brothers of Italy? Is it proper to call them fascist, quasi-fascist, semi-fascist? How should we understand the party and its leader?
Well, it's a neo-fascist party. And if you look at the logo of the party, it has a tricolor flame. And Meloni is trying to tell people now that she's a conservative, and on the American right is chiming in, she's conservative. This is whitewashing, because that flame in the logo is not just the patriotism, it's the colors of the flag. It is the original logo of the neo-fascist party, the Italian social movement that was founded after World War II because Mussolini's party was banned. And this Italian social movement was the party of Meloni's formation. And she wasn't just, I want people to understand, this is a hardcore neo-fascist militant. So she wasn't just a member of the party from 15 years old. She rose to be the head of its student organization, which was a really big deal. And you may see something going around from the 90s where she was speaking in French, where she says Mussolini was a good politician. Everything he did for Italy, which meant participation in the Holocaust, genocide in Libya, all of the mayhem and massacres. That was all for the good of Italy. So she comes out of this neo-fascism, and it's very important that she insisted on keeping that flame in the party's logo. This party, Brothers of Italy, was formed in 2012. And the reason it was formed is that the existing neo-fascist party had fused with Berlusconi's Forza Italia party. And this matters because that left the extreme right without an autonomous party. And she was involved in its founding. And so was this guy named Ignazio La Russa, who said the other day, we are all heirs of Il Duce. So carrying forth the traditions, the values of neo-fascism is integral to who she is and to who her party is, so much so that Mussolini's granddaughter, Rachele, is a politician in the party.
Well, you're certainly sobering us very rapidly here. You mentioned the contradiction of a revolution of reaction. Let me mention another contradiction, which is what your historical scholarship has shown about fascists and authoritarian strongmen, that they use a culture of machismo that projects masculine virility, strength, dominance. That's kind of their pathway to get and retain power. Your last book uses the word strongmen rulers,
Yeah.
but of course, Giorgia Meloni is not a strong man, she's a strong woman. So how do you resolve that contradiction? Does that change things? Does it soften things? Does it make her more palatable? Or are we seeing in Europe what some people think we've seen in Bangladesh, that women political leaders of authoritarian ilk are capable of being, if I may say so, equal opportunity offenders against liberal principles?
No, totally. And one thing that is relevant here that I didn't mention that's absolutely integral to fascism is the leader cult. And the leader cult kind of unifies all of these, what I call the tools of rule in my book of fascism, because the leader cult, historically a man, he is the man who can get away with what other men cannot. So he's lawless, and part of the appeal of authoritarianism is that you get away with it. But there's also the personality cult canons haven't changed in 100 years. So he's the man of the people, and he's also a man above all other men. And so throughout history, you see religious institutions up through Trump, where evangelicals and also Orthodox Jews had said that Trump was there by the will of God. And these are things that recur. So at the end of Strongmen, which I had to give to the publisher in the late summer 2020, and I said that it is inevitable that we will have a female far-right authoritarian government. And I mentioned Marine Le Pen in France. I didn't think of Meloni. And I said that what will be different is they're not going to strip their shirts off like Mussolini and Putin. The machismo and misogyny in that male articulation will be less, but they will be equally corrupt, racist, lawless, and all the other things will continue. And we see this and Meloni is a very interesting case, a little different than Le Pen because of this connection to the Duce. And I'm actually starting to analyze, unfortunately, when you study fascism for years, and my second book was film propaganda, I have spent many, many hours watching not only Mussolini speak, but also his proxies in films, analyzing his voice, his vocabulary. And when I start looking at Meloni, she is a female demagogue. And I urge everybody, unless you are very triggered by, if you come from a Holocaust survivor family and you can't watch Hitler screaming, I don't think you should watch this video I'm about to suggest. It's from June 2022. She was at a rally in Spain of the far-right Vox party. And even if you don't know Spanish, it's on YouTube. She is screaming like a demagogue at the crowd, saying yes to this, no to this, yes to the natural family, no to LGBTQ lobbies, as she calls them, this kind of Manichaean universe. And when I watched it, it was very difficult for me to finish watching it because it was quintessentially fascist. And in a way, she has internalized some of the behaviors and even the cadence of her, let's say, mentor, Mussolini. And I'm going to write about this in the future, but you should watch this video if you're hearing so much that she's a good conservative and she's a patriot, because that video shows you her appeal. She's an incredible fiery orator, but that tradition of oratory, it's not a democratic tradition, it's a fascist tradition.
Okay, so you've described stylistically a part of her appeal, but why did such a, in our eyes, frighteningly far-right or far-right-led coalition win these elections? And, what happened to Italy's center and left parties that enabled it to do so, that gave it the space?
Well, yes, this was well, first of all, there was historically low turnout, and many Italians are disaffected with the whole kind of system of politics. And they're most of all seem to be disaffected with the center left. And this is partly because center left is viewed, the Democratic Party, as it's called, as the main force, is viewed as very establishment by now, very elitist, detached from the concerns of the working class, from working people in general. Italy has very high unemployment. It has a lot of economic problems, has one of the lowest historically female participations in the workforce. And the center left is just not seen as having good solutions to deal with this, nor a good unified message. And one of the mistakes, I'm always looking at what happens in Hungary in elections or here with lessons for our own country, because a lot of what I do is warn people about the GOP, which we'll get to, I know, later. And this, the center left did not unify. And in particular, the Democratic Party did not unify with this other kind of populist party, the Five Star Movement. And that was a big mistake. So they remained fragmented, and that did not help them. So that's part of it. And we see it's really, it's going to necessitate serious reflection and rethinking, because there are certain areas in Italy that have been left-wing since the Socialist Party days of the late 19th century, like Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna, and they had historic losses there. So there is clearly, as we see in other countries, a sense that a Democrat with a small d is not working to fill the needs of the electorate.
So before we come to the US for what I think will be probably no less concerning conversation, I do need to ask you, how bad is this going to get in terms of governance? If you have a kind of neo-fascist leader at the helm of a far-right coalition in Italy, A, what is this going to mean for civil liberties and democratic institutions in Italy? And B, what's it going to mean for Italy's foreign policy and external orientation, for NATO, for the stand against Putin in Ukraine?
Yeah, so we don't know, because she's going to be very constrained. They have a clear majority in parliament. If you take all the parties of her coalition together, the League and Forza Italia, but she's a pragmatist, and it's not in her interest to not compromise with the other forces, because it's very easy to make a government fall in Italy. And so we have to see, so for example, who she appoints as finance minister. Is she going to appoint somebody who's closer to the former President Mario Draghi, who was a technocrat and very big accepted establishment figure in European finance? We'll have to see what she does there. So what we can do, though, which is not good, and Orban's Hungary is a model. We could see Italy, if she stays in power long enough, because remember, Orban's been there for over 10 years. So the things that we're seeing today about Orban's Hungary, the removal of all the liberties, has taken a long time to manifest. But in places where Brothers of Italy has already been governing, like in Verona, what they've done, for example, with reproductive rights, they've made it more difficult for women to access abortion services, because Meloni believes, and her party, in the quote natural family, which is no same-sex unions, no adoption for same-sex couples, and that marriage is a man and a woman. So when you think about her platforms, you can think about these far-right governments in Poland and in Hungary, and many of the platforms of GOP states, and get a sense of that. And in fact, Meloni is very close with the GOP. She's been to the National Prayer Breakfast. One of her biggest mentors is Bannon, who has been counseling her. In fact, Bannon some years ago said that she was too right-wing, and he's been counseling her to moderate her not appearance physically, but her tone, so that she can be received as a conservative. And it's worked for her, and now she's been elected. So we can look to see, what they have done. And that's, xenophobia. She's on record talking about we shouldn't have new mosques built in Italy. We don't want people who don't speak Italian, so kind of stoking, we can expect more hate crimes to manifest in Italy against non-Christian, non-white populations. Again, abortion rights challenged. And also people are very nervous about reforms they want to make to the Constitution. That's the big thing. I'll just mention Italy's Constitution. It was formed in 1948 because they needed a new constitution for a democratic age after the end of fascism. And it was written very explicitly to have democratic protections, so that it had many constraints on the role of the president and the role of the prime minister. So you could never have, the idea was you could never have a demagogue in power again. And they want to reform certain things that people are nervous about because it would erode that anti-fascist nature of the Constitution.
Well, let's turn to the US now and talk about fascism. Many people like myself, I'm just going to be honest with you, have hesitated to use the F word, and I mean here fascism, to describe the MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump himself, in part because it carried a whiff of rhetorical escalation and, could be seen to be further polarizing things by suggesting that anyone who supports Trump or voted for a MAGA Republican, and there were 70 million plus Americans who voted for Trump in 2020, is ipso facto anti-democratic. But, the line has been crossed. President Biden himself compared the Trump philosophy to semi-fascism. And, if the shoe fits, I mean, you look at January 6th, you look at the character of the appeals, the growing threats of violence, the even celebration of it, the resentment, the illiberalism, the violence. Is that the right word? How would you characterize Donald Trump and his hardcore MAGA Republicans today on this spectrum of fascism?
Well, I also was one of the holdouts. I did not use the word fascism. I did that for several reasons. Some were strategic in that I felt that it would turn people off. And it also is, if you're trying to build bridges, labeling everybody as a fascist, which is it's very satisfying to say, and it has a lot of truth to it. The things that Trump was doing as president, that's one of the theses of strongmen, is that I saw immediately who he was. I wrote a lot of things in 2015-16 that predicted what he was going to do. How was I able to do that? Because I'm not a specialist in American politics. It's because I studied fascism. The minute I saw him at the rally talking about victimhood, when he said, this is emblazoned in my brain, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I wouldn't lose any followers, which he did. Like, who does that early in their candidacy? Well, authoritarians do. So I have been calling him an authoritarian because I felt that fascism encompassed part of what he was doing, but not all, because he's very much, we're in the 21st century, and there are things that are different today, such as you don't shut down elections. You keep elections going, and then you game the system. And Viktor Orban has done this in Hungary, which is why the GOP is sitting at his feet, genuflecting, and always has him as a mentor. But as things have intensified, and the GOP after January 6th has become more and more lawless, and basically it's actively remaking itself as an authoritarian party. We're witnessing history in America. It is transforming itself to support autocracy. So it's kicking out moderates, Liz Cheney, Kinzinger, anybody who opposed Trump. And then Trump's personality cult, his leader cult, is extraordinary. It's very unusual for somebody to be gone from office for so long and still have such a robust leader cult. So that's very fascist. So I will use it selectively now. I've called Tucker Carlson a fascist demagogue many times on MSNBC, and I think he is one.
We're clearly in a situation of drift and of pretty worrisome and authoritarian evolution on the political right, the MAGA Republican right in the United States, toward at least illiberal and authoritarian sentiments and styles of behavior and rhetoric and mobilization and so on, and ones that, I'll put it in the language I've used recently, have fascist properties to them.
Yes.
Is there a way of marginalizing these kinds of politicians, these kinds of behaviors, and their most fanatical followers without alienating everybody and further polarizing the situation by suggesting that everyone who votes for them is by definition anti-democratic? What's the sweet spot, the strategy there?
Well, we see what's been happening with the threat to abortion rights, reproductive rights, which has gone too far, and there's been a backlash. And I think now there's been a strategy to really talk about certain Republicans who are MAGA Republicans. And that's a way to separate the others who may not still believe in Trump's godliness. And it's a very dynamic situation because Trump has more and more pressure on him, which is why he's, by the way, trying to refresh his cult with QAnon people, which is very scary. But there's DeSantis waiting in the wings to be the person who's still authoritarian, but with less baggage. So it's a dynamic situation. I do think that part of this is they are their own worst enemies, as we saw with abortion rights. I also think that if there is more low-level political violence around elections, around voting, that is going to turn on, that will delight some people, the real fanatics, but it will turn off others. And historically, prosecution is extremely important to start deflating a personality cult, and also to show people that the rule of law is important, that accountability is important, and that these strong men are not indeed infallible. And so an example is Berlusconi in Italy, who is one of the most corrupt leaders ever to be in Europe. He had innumerable corruption trials. He's actually back with Meloni. He's part of her coalition. And I like to remind people he's a convicted criminal of wiretapping, bribery, tax fraud, forgetting the other thing, and sex with a minor. Those are the things he was convicted on. But it was very, very important because he was like a god, all powerful in Italy because he owned TV networks. But he was forced out in 2011 because of the Eurozone crisis. He was forced to resign. And after that, they started finally to prosecute him. And he didn't have the power to change the laws, to run out the clock, and all the things he did for many, many years while he was prime minister to avoid prosecution. So he was convicted in 2013. And he was banned from politics for 5 years. And that's what made his party shrink to single digits. And that's what ended his personality cult. And indeed, even though he's back, he's not going to have any real power. He's just a marginal figure. So prosecution, and he didn't go to jail because he was too old for Italian laws. He did community service instead in a church-owned facility, but he was convicted, and that that's why I've written in my Substack newsletter that Trump should be prosecuted, and talked about the importance of prosecuting these authoritarian figures. Even though people fear it can bring more violence, they're already having violence, and long-term to preserve democracy and let people who are followers start to get out of the cult, out of the influence, prosecution is actually a good thing.
So you have answered my next question, and I just want to say before asking my last question, before we turn to the audience questions, I strongly agree with you. And those who say we should pull back, it'll just provoke his most extreme followers, I think are missing the fundamental point you make. And those who want to defend a rule of law make, that first of all, we need to delegitimize this personality and this style of political behavior. And second of all, we need to show that the system can defend itself. And of course, this is where, for example, the Weimar Republic was so weak and ineffective. So you write a lot about how to push back, and prosecution for illegal acts is one of the things that you argue. For example, in the extremely, if I can use the word, lucid essay you were invited to contribute to The Economist last year. So you identify other pieces of a playbook for rescuing democracy. Can you mention the most important of those?
Yeah, so domestically, and after writing about all the corruption and violence and sexism, it was a great relief, because this was not an easy book to write, especially as a female scholar. It was a great relief to get to the resistance chapter. And I actually had photographs of people who had been, killed by various regimes on my desk, to kind of writing in homage to them. So nonviolent protest, nonviolent mass protest has repeatedly around the world been a very effective way of striking back at autocracies at the right moment, or preventing them from consolidating. It's not enough on its own, but when it's paired with, it can, if there's very large protests and they're consistent, it can lead elites to engage in what we call elite defection, when people who have been important pillars of the regime, or even like secondary figures, but they start peeling off because they realize that the destiny of the country is not going to go the way of the leader. And I'm tracking, and I'm writing a ton in Lucid about Putin. I wrote a piece 3 days after he invaded Ukraine, saying that this wasn't going to go very well for him. That was in MSNBC, and predicting a lot of the stuff that happened, and including elite defections. So nonviolent protest is absolutely key. And that's why, for example, in the States, there's so many Republican states passing laws to make protest criminal. That's why in sitting regimes, whether it's Turkey or Russia, protesters can be defined as terrorists. And William Barr, who's trying to have like a rehabilitation reputation tour, he was, if you look at his speeches to the police during the Trump era, he was going down a path of trying to define civil disobedience as some kind of terrorist activity, which is like totally authoritarian. But the other category of pushing back is getting at the large web of international enablers of strongmen. And we've seen this, to keep with the Putin example, in all of the global outpouring of support and solidarity for sanctions. But there's a whole web of international law firms, PR firms have been very, very important. That's kind of a sub-theme of strongman, all the PR firms. And wealth managers, people who allow these guys to hide their money. So Putin has a fully realized kleptocracy. I also I have a corruption chapter, and that was very interesting. How does corruption change over 100 years? It went from, having Swiss bank accounts, and now it's the offshore finance system. But whatever the mechanism, the despot relies on foreign enablers. So we need to do a far better job. And there's a lot of new legislation in Congress against kleptocracy now. There's been a kind of renaissance, and not just since the war, in the last years, I would say from 2018 or so. And that's very, very good news. But what we still need to name and shame the law firms, the wealth managers, the PR firms who prop these people up and whitewash them. And the reason I'm hitting so hard right now against Meloni being described as a conservative is that this kind of control of a narrative is they're doing it at the beginning so they can, and you can expect that they're going to try and present her as a mainstream figure. And she'll have her own PR firms. I'm sure American PR firms are competing to represent her as I speak. So that's part of it. There's domestic, and then there's the kind of constellation of foreign and global, enablers. And you have to get ideally to all of them.
Yeah, and one of the things that worries me is that these two postmodern authoritarian leaders, Viktor Orban in Hungary and Giorgia Meloni in Italy, are potentially, you can react to this, going to form maybe even a more clever and insidious alliance than the working relationship between the law and justice governments in Poland and Orban in Hungary.
I think so. And I think that something that is quite underreported, I'm going to be doing an op-ed on it, but will be just a small thing, is this large network of it's like I studied in my first book, Fascist Modernity. I had a lot about the Fascist International, because you asked me at the beginning, what's fascism? Fascism is always another paradox, another contradiction. Hyper-nationalist, right? Imperialist, hyper-nationalist, but also transnational. Always conceived of as a transnational force to bring about a new order, as it became known in World War II. So now we're seeing, and we don't have to use the F word, fascist international, we could call it the far right, but there is a lot of activity, and Orban's Hungary, Budapest is a hub. A lot of it was financed by Moscow. And Meloni said something very intriguing, and I put it in an MSNBC piece I just published on her. She said that we work with Republicans closely. We consider them our allies. Their battles are things that we have spoken of, and we have all kinds, I'm not quoting exactly, but we have all kinds of international exchanges. And she mentioned something called Republicans International, as well as the Heritage Foundation. And so to have a sense of, there are 2 points here. One is the scope of these far-right transnational networks. And the point is to have alliances that won't be perhaps military alliances, but this whole new cultural world, that cultural political order that is emerging, that is anti-democratic, that is against the EU, right? So that's a main point there.
It's an authoritarian international.
It is an authoritarian international. And the Washington Post recently published, there was an intelligence cable which showed that Putin has been, since 2013-14, funneling millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to political parties all over the world to have exactly this kind of movement. The other notable thing is that I've been writing hundreds of pieces to try and get Americans to accept the idea that authoritarianism can be American, right? That Trump was an authoritarian leader. But Meloni said very matter-of-factly that the GOP is like her party. So the GOP is really become a far-right authoritarian party. And I started to say before, they're kicking out moderates, but if you look at who they're inviting in, it really reminds me of early fascism, as in Il Duce. When you're going to have a political culture suited for autocracy, you've got to have lawless and criminal people in there. So who is being solicited to run for office? So you have oath keepers, like actual extremists, like this guy, Mark Fincham. There are people here from Arizona, I know. So, you know, he used to be a politician despite being an oath keeper. And now it's like a really good thing to be an oath keeper. And so he's now the candidate for Secretary of State of Arizona, being a proud self-proclaimed oath keeper. You also have people who were participating in January 6th, even breaching the Capitol. So these are criminals. So you have all these lawless people coming in, and the Nazis and the fascists used to cultivate criminals and bring them into government because, of course, you want criminals in government if you're a corrupt and lawless regime. You need those people because they're experts. It sounds all very bleak and cynical, but this is, I watch these processes going on in the GOP from my vantage point, which is not American history, but global autocracy. And unfortunately, I see the same things going on.
Thanks. Now, let's try and do a lightning round of some quick questions and answers to the questions from the audience. Doug Morell asks, I guess the constitutional threshold for amendment is a 2/3 majority, and Meloni's far-right coalition, I think, doesn't have that. So does that should that ease our sense of alarm that she's not going to have a chance to amend the Italian constitution?
It could, and then many other people, and Yasha Monk wrote a piece in The Atlantic, who's saying, well, we shouldn't worry too much because she's not going to be there very long. Because it's so easy to get rid of governments and all kinds of other alliances. This is a problem. Our bipartisan system is a huge problem for us right now because there's only these two parties. In other places, there have been many examples of multi-party coalitions that have organized to get rid of a threat to democracy. But I believe that when there's an extremist experiment, and this is an experiment, a neo-fascist party governing, never happened before, the effects of the normalization it brings, the legitimation remain in the system, even if it's short-lived. So although they may not be able to accomplish a lot of the nefarious things they want to, the optimist reading is that this shock will lead the center-left to get its act together. And I am an optimist in such things. The other read is that taboos are broken and precedents are set, and then it becomes easier to, these people think long-term, just like the Koch brothers and the right here. The right wing thinks very long-term. These are long-term political designs. So we'll just have to see. So
before I come back to Meloni and her government and its prospects, I have to pose another question that comes from our audience because it really raises a long-term question about taboos broken in the United States. So Betsy asks, since there's a cult of personality around Trump, does the threat of kind of MAGA, extreme authoritarianism, quasi-fascism, whatever you want to call it, can it survive Trump? Or is it kind of what you're saying, that a new leader could kind of pick up the baton and take it in a new but very dangerous direction?
Yeah, Betsy, that's a great question. I thought about that a lot. It's 2 words, Ron DeSantis. who has, I've already written like, I don't know, 5 or 6 pieces on the guy. I've written enough about him that his press secretary is baiting me on Twitter all the time. And she's a far right activist, Christina Pushaw, by the way. You should look at her if you want to understand him. But what he has done, he absorbed the lessons of Trump to see what you can get away with, what is marketable, what is successful. And you may know that he became like a diehard, he advertised himself as a diehard Trumpian when he was running for governor. And he even used his infant as a prop. He made a campaign ad. If you want to understand who this person is, Ron DeSantis, look at this campaign ad where he had a Trump flag in his infant's crib to show how gung-ho he was. It was like an altar to Trump and so you know how he's using migrants as props and also making all those fake arrests of people through his election security. This was the first prop, was his infant. So he has absorbed the lessons of Trump, even imitating his gestures when he speaks. And he's done it marvelously. And yet he poses as a more moderate figure, a more conservative figure, although he's just as extreme. And that's what happens sometimes, because really no one is as criminal as Trump. He's a very unique figure in his criminality. He's criminal in so many ways, and sexual assaults and, collaborations with multiple mafias, with Russia. I mean, it's really hard to find somebody else except maybe Berlusconi. Yeah. So this is what can happen, is that somebody like Trump, they shake up the system and they let others see the potential of being that kind of politician, the strongman. And DeSantis is the one who's taking this furthest so far of all the GOP. And he has, that's why he has 40 billionaires backing him. He's got a lot of support.
So let's talk about, you said this has got a transnational character to it. A lot of the challenges to democracy and the hope for democracy in earlier eras involved diffusion of norms, values, movements, political styles. So there's one listener asks, what's in the ether here that is causing this diffusion? That's what Terry asks. And others ask, where else should we be worried about? Or how does this compare with the victory of the Sweden Democrats and where they may be headed? Where else do you see extreme right, anti-democratic, maybe quasi-fascist parties gaining a foothold and possibly being poised to win power? And then I'll add one more angle to that, which is how Giorgia Meloni would compare with Marine Le Pen, who you did mention, and her party, which after all did do better in the presidential election than the Le Pens have done before.
Yes.
So review the spectrum for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. There, and every situation is unique. There are far right parties in most countries at this point, and it's true that so for example, Meloni is worrisome not only for internal Italian politics and European politics, but because it gives momentum to this whole transnational movement, which has also manifested in Sweden. And so that's, that's something that I hesitate to say beyond the fact that there is a disaffection with democracy. There is a sense of joy, and this sounds weird to say, a joy in having the kind of communities and togetherness that right-wing politics is offering right now, the rallies, the chants, the pleasure in being the victim, all of that, it manifests in all of these nations. Also the joy of having clear and defined enemies, Muslims, right? Jews, also, of course, whenever you have intolerance, you also, even if Jews are not mentioned as the primary target. And one of the things that's very fascinating is from historic fascism to now, I talked about victimhood, and not just the leader as the victim, but the idea that the nation was victimized. And I said at the beginning, in the 30s, it was the 20s and 30s, it was the League of Nations. Now it's the EU and George Soros and these nefarious casts of characters, but the mechanism psychologically is the same. The need to feel that you are morally righteous because you've been victimized. This is a part of right-wing politics that is very strong today.
Incredibly, Ruth, we're running out of time. It's painful to acknowledge because I've got an hour of additional questions I'd like to ask you. But I have to close with this question. You've talked about the perverse and resentful joy that's expressing itself from these twisted causes on the right. Can you give us any cause for democratic joy or hope that you see on the horizon, whether in Europe or the United States, or in terms of a kind of transnational response?
Yeah, I can. It's really, when I started Lucid, when you start a newsletter, you have like a manifesto. And in this manifesto, sentence 1 was authoritarianism is spreading around the world. We know that. I know that. Number 2, so is resistance. 2019 was a global record for nonviolent resistance all over the world. In India, in Chile, for economic inequality, there were the biggest protests since the days of the military dictatorship. And then 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, what happens in the US, the largest social protest movement, Black Lives Matter, in American history. And before that, 2017, the Women's March, which we don't talk about enough, was itself the largest in American history. So there is a vast universe, even just if we limit it to our country, of action and of bridge building, of countless organizations that are labor, unions are making a resurgence. There's a lot going on to resist authoritarianism, and we can flip the script. And the thing is, we don't hear enough about that. And one could say, well, okay, you're guilty. You're the one who's always talking to us about these strongmen. But that's why there's a chapter on resistance in my book. And I also talk about nonviolent protest all the time, because that is going on. And I actually think that these aging guys, the Modis and the Trumps, and they know that their number is up, and they're all looking at Putin in terror. The whole paradigm of fossil fuels, of kleptocracy, it is like on its way out. It has to be. And so they're clinging like for dear life to try and exploit and plunder as much as possible, because truly, I think there is a new era coming. And I watched Chile very closely. Chile's in my book for the military dictatorship, and the election of this he's now 36, a 36-year-old former labor activist, Gabriel Boric, as president. And they tried to rewrite the Constitution. I wrote a piece about this in Lucid, and it didn't pass. A lot of people hated it, but it was absolutely revolutionary. And it was really like a document of our anti-authoritarian future. It gave rights to animals, to nature. It integrated indigenous rights into the Constitution. It's an incredible document. It's a big mess, and they're going to try again. But there are all kinds of things going on that if we choose to focus on those and the momentum that those have, and that's something that can give us hope, because it's real.
Well, and if I may say so in closing, as a sociologist, there can also be joy in the act of coming together, joining together as fellow citizens to fight for our rights, defend our values, and find community and a common cause of A, resisting authoritarianism, and B, pursuing a renewed and deeper democracy.
Absolutely. It's very moving, and I could just speak for myself where when Trump arrived on the scene, I just changed my whole professional life. I was doing an academic book on World War II. I put it aside to do strongmen. I started writing for CNN, TV, and I have found an incredible community and learned about an incredible community of people working to save democracy. And it's very moving. And I think we just don't talk about those heroes enough. We don't showcase all those wonderful people who are working often behind the scenes for the good of our country. And as a first generation of American, I'm very proud to be doing my small part for this. And there is a joy and there is a community in democracy work.
Great. Well, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, I want to thank you for a remarkable and in the end, not only intellectually scintillating, but also uplifting and reassuring set of remarks. I want to thank Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates Incorporated and our moving forces here, Janice Kamener-Resnick, David Lehrer, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, and their colleagues for creating and sustaining this community. I want to remind all of our viewers that we will be dark next week in observance of Yom Kippur. And the following week of October 12th, 2 weeks from tonight, we will have Dahlia Lithwick of Newsweek and Slate discussing her just published book, Lady Justice, Women, Law, and the Battle to Save Democracy. That will be on October 12th, moderated by our dear friend and UCLA law professor, Rick Hasen. Until then, we wish you good health, safe passage, and if you are observing and celebrating the Jewish New Year, a safe and healthy New Year. Thank you all so much.